And psilocybin mushrooms, there's, I think, 185 species of mushrooms that produce psilocybin. They grow naturally on every continent but Antarctica. And every indigenous person and group that lives in an area which has microdosing has mushrooms has used them historically both as microdoses and in higher doses, usually in rituals. That was a
And
long
we
way
do
of saying
have
LSD and psilocybin, I know, but that's the way it goes.
excellent. We do have a question in the chat. So this is from our friends down in St. Louis.
Yes.
Jim, from your decades of collecting self-reports, what single experiment or maybe real world metric would you most like to see that could definitively show whether microdosing boosts performance beyond placebo and why that particular measure?
Well, the placebo question, placebo usually is a kind of pejorative word, which is you didn't really do it yourself. If you actually look at it, placebo means the natural healing response of the human being. And it's one of the fantastic reasons that any of us are alive today, which is our body responds to stress, responds to bacteria, responds to wounds with healing. Also, when we are focused and concentrated, think of the hardest exams you've ever taken, we can actually focus in a way where we're using a lot of parts of our system, physiological system, all dedicated to a particular outcome. So, at one point, someone said, well, what if it's only placebo? And I'm thinking, well, if it only helps everyone in the world with many, many conditions, I don't mind whatever it's called. Now, that's one way. Let's now look at the hard science for a moment, because now after 10 or 15 years, we have it. If you are measuring brain waves and you are measuring whether cognitive fluency and flexibility increases, a very common description of microdose use, and you're giving, in this case, LSD, you're giving around between 10 and 13 micrograms, and you find exactly that effect. There's an increase in cognitive fluency and flexibility, better retention of memory, etc. These are all cognitive tests, but you're also measuring the brain waves. And what you notice is somewhere around 5 or 6 micrograms, the brain waves begin to shift, and at 10 or 12, 13 micrograms, they have shifted into the same pattern that brain waves will have with a very high dose, just at a much lower amplitude. If you then continue to up the dose, by the time you get to around 20 micrograms, the effect of increased cognitive fluency, basically benefits, goes away. And what you begin to have is somewhat erratic brain waves and, again, a similar model to what you sometimes see on psychedelics. We've all seen the picture of the brain with a few colored lines. And we have seen the brain with a lot of colored lines, and then it says under whatever psychedelic they're using. So, from my point of view, what we've learned is psychedelics cause colored lines in the brain, and that's about as really as clear as we know. Um, what we do know is that the pattern of colored lines is the same with a correct dose of microdose up to a certain point. And then what people report, again, we're asking subjective reports, um, at 13 micrograms, actually, they don't know whether they have taken a psychedelic or not. Their brain knows because we're measuring it, but they don't report that they can necessarily tell the difference between that and placebo. By the time you get to 20, they know. And what no means, and this is for many of you who've had psychedelics, they begin to feel as if they might begin to take off. This might be a real, they have that opening feeling of a higher dose. They become aware of a different kind of brain flexibility, meaning distraction. They'll be much more interested, maybe in the nature of their thumb than in the problem they wanted to solve. And what that distinction is they are no longer in the microdose area. They're no longer in the sweet spot in which microdosing and its effects occur. So yes, there is, with every known test and every known medication, placebo effects. And also, if you're, well, very simply, here's placebo. Okay, hey, there's a great new restaurant. I think you're really going to love the the pizza there. So when you enter the restaurant, you are already primed in a direction to that benefits you. Okay. And so you are already more likely to like that restaurant than if someone says, I know you have to go to that restaurant because your company is taking you, but honestly, the food's garbage. Okay. We're not changing the food, we're not changing anything else, but we have minds and they affect us. We have effects, but you can't use your mind and say, I'm going to pretend that I'm not eating. Okay? Your body says, no, you can't do that. We're smarter than that. So your mind has some effect, and it's important. And what all the high dose research does is they power pack all the placebo possibilities they can into the study because they want it to work. And the people who are taking a high dose in particular want it to work. So there's a huge placebo effect in high dose work and a very small one in microdose work where you're getting a mushroom from somebody you don't know. And they say, I hope this is useful to you. So you have much less of the kind of natural healing response, except if you've used microdosing. What people report is, I don't feel much, but I certainly look forward to microdosing days
Hmm,
because I feel better during them.
that's
Thank you.
great. That's great.
Thank you, St.
Cheryl, did you have
Louis.
a question? Just make sure that is switched on and the blue light's
Okay,
on.
it's
All
on.
right.
The light's on. Hi there.
Hi.
I have a question about back to the substances that you already mentioned.
Yeah.
Are all psychedelic substances microdosable?
Okay. Let's there's classic psychedelics. Classic psychedelics have a similar group, and they include LSD and psilocybin. They include mescaline. They include um, Banisteriopsis caapi, which is part of ayahuasca. And they have similar effects, and they work in similar ways. There are a lot of other substances which change consciousness that don't work the same way. Um, 5-MeO-DMT, which is becoming quite popular, has a very, very short internal life, like 15, 20 minutes. Um, it's very, very hard to take a small enough dose so that
Sure.
you don't have um, the full come on of 5-MeO. So the answer is mostly with classic psychedelics, they operate about the same, and with other substances, um, it's all over the map. And then you have other substances which are becoming also popular called Amanita muscaria. That's the Christmas
That's
mushroom.
the one.
It has an entirely different biochemical pathway. It just doesn't go to the same parts of the brain in the same way as psychedelics. And it also is unique in that if you take a fair amount of it, it's very bad for you.
Hmm.
It's usually listed in mushroom books as toxic. Now, that's because overdoses are easy to have when you're dealing with very small amounts of a chemical.
Well,
Did you
hold
feel
on.
answered?
Yeah, I did. I just gave the mic away. I was actually still talking. So as a shop owner, I carry Amanita muscaria gummies here because it's the only. I'm not trying to plug my business. I'm trying to problem solve. I really am. But it's the only legal one.
Right.
You know, I have plenty of clients that come in here and are seeking answers. So it's the only legal one,
Well,
correct?
it's actually considered extremely good for relieving anxiety in the right dose.
Okay, thank you.
And
Um,
according to a wonderful Amanita farmer who's like 25 years of Amanita um, from their organic farm, they make a lot of other things. He said when Amanita got popular last year, they went from 20 outlets that he could keep track of to 400 that were selling Amanita. And he said except a lot of them weren't because there wasn't that much amanita. Because amanita is not commercially growable. It's literally has to be picked from the trees it grows under. So there was a great confusion, and a number of the quote amanitas that he tested were actually psilocybin. So unfortunately, the government, by keeping things illegal, also makes it very hard to do kind of accurate labeling. And we all know there was a candy bar company that put out some amazing amount of junk and called them psychedelic microdoses, and a lot of people got sick, seriously sick, until
Wow.
the government kind of closed that company down. So we are not, we are kind of before the Food and Drug Administration, as we were in the United States, and you have to actually be careful. So if you're carrying a amanita from someone you know and trust, probably, and you've heard people say it's working well for them, that's exactly what's true.
Great question. I think we may try to do like a back and forth. So we'll take one from the chat and then we'll get
Yeah.
another one in person. But one question from the chat was a good one was, does the microdose effect start with the first dosing or is there a ramp up period?
Both. Um, since the if you description of a microdose, and there was a wonderful book called A Really Good Day, which which is a woman overcoming very suicidal depression with microdosing. But what a really good day means is you've microdosed and you feel pretty good and you go to work and you actually are focused and you only answer the emails that should be answered and you don't, you don't watch a newscast on something. Um, you notice during the day that you are actually nice to someone who doesn't deserve it. After work, you go to the gym, and what you notice, because you're really paying attention, is you actually do just one more set of reps. You come home and you really enjoy the kids more than usual. And at some point, you say to your spouse, I'm having a really good day. And then you say, oh, yeah, I forgot I microdosed. That's one dose. If you're taking it for something um, like depression, what we have is a number of reports that people after 2 or 3 doses, in many cases, notice a rapid shift in their depression. And other people we know, they say it's gradual over several weeks. So the answer is both. But what people basically notice is they feel a little better when they microdose. They're aware that they are a little more in their body. Um, the flowers are a little bit brighter, but they don't turn and smile and tell you secrets. So your day is one in which you are more effective and you are kind of nicer to yourself.
Say, Jim, I was going to ask you, you mentioned in your book about microdosing in indigenous societies. Could you
Yeah.
elaborate a little bit more about that?
Well, what we know is every indigenous society that had access to all kinds of things obviously used them. And when I was first developing microdosing, I had zero awareness and zero background in working with indigenous people and their use of drugs. So what we did modern microdosing because it doesn't fit the indigenous models. But what we do know, let me just give you an example. Ibogaine, which is um, the chemical in a shrub called iboga in Gabon, predominantly in Africa. It's part of deep in their religious tradition. And there is a coming of age passage, which includes like 3 or 4 days of uh, with several large doses of ibogaine, and ibogaine can last up to 36 hours. It's done in a tribal manner. It's done with dancing and with exercises and practices. One of the goals is to contact your ancestors, and it's quite an amazing description of what can be done with the help of a little plant. And if you read almost all the reports, that's as far as it goes, meaning they didn't ask, do you use it for anything else? Well, a filmmaker, a very important filmmaker named Lucy Walker, was doing some work in Gabon. And she said, do you use it for anything else? And I said, yeah, sure. Oh, what else do you use it for? Well, we use it for hunting. Now, if you've ever had a high dose of psychedelics, you're not going hunting. You're probably not walking, okay, because the floor may turn into a cathedral or an ocean. But it turns out if you take a small dose, a microdose, we know your visual acuity improves, and there is something in the book talking about that. Your coordination improves, and we know it from a lot of sports, which now are more and more sports, by the way, are using quietly microdosing. And for hunting, what you get is visual acuity, increased coordination, and increased endurance. That's perfect for hunting. And then Lucy said, "Do you use it for anything else?" They said, "Well, yeah, it's really good for sex too." Okay. So indigenous people, like the rest of us, try stuff. And when I was, as I say, early on, I was at one point I had this kind of messianic fantasy, which, as you know, sometimes happens to psychedelic researchers. And I thought, I have discovered microdosing. And I mentioned it not quite that stupidly to a friend who was an anthropologist. And he said, "Really?" He said, "Imagine that you're an indigenous people and you've been using mushrooms and other psychedelics for maybe 4 or 5,000 years. Do you think they would have tried small doses?" I thought, oh, yes, they would. So what we know is that we are contributing to the many different ways in which microdoses have been used. And we're now getting to the next level, which is to cooperate and help each other. There is a group in Peru called Micro Ayahuasca. They train people throughout the Latin Americas in the use of microdosing, predominantly for, again, health and therapeutics. The medicine that they use, which is ayahuasca in countries where that's legal, is prepared for them by their colleagues in microhuasca who are Shipibo shamans. So that the Shipibo shaman determines in meeting the person what's the appropriate medicine for them of all the things that the Shipibo know about. So it's a very nice blend. And they also have a training of how to train facilitators or therapists. And most of their trained facilitators are already licensed therapists throughout South America. And it's a much different model than we've developed here and has been developed in Europe. And the group in Holland, who are the major group in Europe, got so interested in their training, they said, I think we'll use your training model, not ours. So we're beginning to get this kind of cross-fertilization as different groups do better at different things. So indigenous people are just one of the groups using it. And the word indigenous, of course, means up to several hundred different groups.
Excellent. We have a in-person question. Just make sure that's switched on. You see the blue light, and you're all good. Talk right into it.
Hello.
Hello.
Uh, I've seen some reports showing that LSD and psilocybin have different effects, and
Yes.
some saying that they are essentially the same. And I was wondering if you had seen any either self-reports that you've combed through or studies showing people microdosing on both LSD and
Yeah.
psilocybin concurrently.
Well, this brings us to a very interesting problem, which a lot of people say to me, well, you have all these interesting reports, but what's the science? Meaning, has it been squashed down into a study where it can be taught statistically rather than real world evidence? And the answer is, yeah, it can, because science, that particular kind of science exists. And I studied at this point, there was a wonderful study which measured the difference between psilocybin and LSD on about 10 different physiological uh, discriminatories. And it was mostly things that you would think about, again, coordination and cognitive fluency and so forth. And sure enough, they came up with a difference. The only difference they saw between the two substances measured physiologically in a laboratory setting. Psilocybin didn't last as long. Now, those of us who know almost nothing about these substances know that much. But that was not the only study. How about the difference in psychological differences? And so there was another study, equally well done. These are really well done studies. And it measured maybe, I think, 11 psychological variables, cognitive variables, between the two substances, matched for dose. And that, again, you have to know something. I think you're guessing where we're going on this, which is yes, there was a major difference. Psilocybin doesn't last as long. Okay? So that's the science. Now, your question, however, is based on because you're in the larger world of the millions of users who've done this over decades, where it is generally agreed that for problems demanding more cognitive intensity, as one young man once said to me, I only microdose when I have a coding problem. That's a very intellectual use, okay? For or philosophical problems, or just analysis, where we're using those parts of the mind closest to reason. LSD seems to be uh, the better choice because it's just been described by Stan Grof as a non-specific amplifier, meaning you can focus much more easily um, on that area of the mind with LSD. What again is said by people with lots and lots of experience, that for problems or interests that are more about the self and the soul and the personality and emotions and feelings, that psilocybin is preferred. And the explanation usually given is because psilocybin comes from a living thing, and in some sense there is an essential um, divinity, perhaps, of psilocybin, and certainly, supposedly, very much with ayahuasca, that is almost personal. And therefore, the kind of plant to person is much more intense. And for those issues, those are preferred. And if you think about it, um, many of you have said, who've used ayahuasca, describe ayahuasca as grandmother ayahuasca or grandfather ayahuasca or mother ayahuasca. And psilocybin, not as often, but often described as with a spiritual kind of oversight. And nobody ever says, and LSD never gets that. It's not Mr. LSD or Dr. LSD or shaman LSD. It's just LSD seems to be what it is, a mostly synthetic chemical. So there is that difference as appreciated. What we found in terms of the book and the number of conditions, depression, autism, a very wide range of things, that we couldn't distinguish between the two. And we once did one of my wonderful research for people that I worked with named Sophia Cohen. We took 100 reports from Irwin that mentioned that they were LSD and 100 reports that mentioned they were psilocybin. And we ran them through a very early version of AI saying, what's the difference between these two groups? And you can't recognize the words psilocybin or LSD. That's kind of blanked out. So is there any difference in this pile and this pile? And that analysis at that point said, no, there was nothing they could distinguish in the larger picture. So the answer is yes, in some ways, and not in many others. It's fundamentally the same effect with some very different kind of maybe focus points.
Great answer. Did you have a follow-up? Okay. Actually, I had a question, Jim, because you did mention
Yeah.
collating and collecting a lot of these stories and conditions and things. Of those conditions that you've come across, so like when I talk about conditions, meaning like maybe being treated with microdosing, so anxiety or even traumatic brain injury,
Yep.
things like that, where microdosing has helped those folks. Was there any condition or case that jumped out at you or surprised you the most in doing this research?
That's why I do this research. I do it for the surprises. Okay. And the surprises are when, um, well, I started most psychedelic research, if you notice, is only about mental issues. Almost all of the high dose research. And so if someone says, I have neuropathy, Psychedelics don't rise immediately, of course. What you need is a psychedelic. So we have been conditioned not only to medicalize psychedelics, but to kind of mentalize them. So it's very rare to find, and we're getting it. We're now getting reports. People are now looking at multiple sclerosis, of Parkinson's. Um, the well, let me give you what I like is a recent surprise, okay? Because it's just blows me away. And I like to talk about things that aren't in the book because there are so many things in the book. You'll get to it eventually, or you'll borrow it from a friend and you'll get to it eventually. I get a letter from someone not in the United States who talks about his own background and the amount of trauma in his background. He was a government drug agent, slept with a gun underneath his pillow for some years. And eventually he ends up having a lot of physical symptoms, so much that he thinks he has to quit his job. And his wife suggests microdosing because she's been interested in natural substances and had some training as a college student. And he uses uh, psilocybin, both higher dose and microdose, and recovers from whatever his PTSD seemed to be. And so that's a piece of background, okay? He then says, the reason I gave you the background is because my son had flunked out of high school in his junior year. And he had always been, and I think I'm not quoting correctly, but very strange. He had never had very good social skills. Um, from a very tiny baby, he just behaved differently um, and didn't do well in school with anybody. And he was basically not only dropped out, but he then got into a very deep depression. And his parents said to him, would you consider microdosing? And his initial response, which again tells us about the culture, um, I'm not one of those druggies like all the other kids in my class. So he was like drug pure. Um, and they said, well, here's some information. This might help. And they talked. And then he finally said, you've become a lot nicer, Dad. You're a lot easier to be with. And I've been noticing it in the last month or two. Are you microdosing? And his father says, yes, I am. He says, okay. Now, this was the beginning of summer holiday. During the summer, he becomes nicer. He becomes more aware of other people. He becomes part of does chores like the rest of the family. He becomes agreeable. And as the school term is about to begin, he says to his father, I want to go back to high school. Will you help me? So they go to high school, and he says to his father, I want to take all advanced placement courses. Okay? Now remember, he's been flunked out. And all of his teachers say no, except one, his math teacher. And his math teacher says, okay, but I want you to know you're going to have to do, and I love this because it's a math teacher, 189% of the curriculum in order for you to get what you want. And the kid says, great. Okay. The school year goes through. He takes the national exams in all his subjects. He does quite well in math. He does the best in the class in math. He does the best the school had ever had in math. Okay? And he gets all A's in his other classes. That's microdosing at its most fascinating because what we know, and here he is not using this term, but the chances are this is someone with what we call as high functioning autism or Asperger's. Very smart and incredibly poor social skills, and there are reasons for that. Microdosing overcomes the social skill problem. The good mind is still there. So that's the kind of um, amazing part. So that yes, you feel better and you do one more rep at the gym because you're not curing anything because you're a healthy human being. You're just improving your health. I remember a physician years ago, I was getting treated for something, and I said, "How long will this treatment be?" He said, "How healthy do you want to be?" And I thought, wait a moment. I've just been told that there isn't an upper limit necessarily for this kind of healing, and so the miracles happen. There are other miracles which are totally different than that, but that's a good one.
That is a good one. Bruce, you had a question?
Well, I'm gonna change it. So you had mentioned a little about the physical conditions. What do you think the mechanism of action might be regarding like pain, chronic and acute, as far as microdosing? You had mentioned some
Yeah.
physical
Well,
afflictions.
actually, pain we might actually know something about. Most of, by the way, I've learned something, which is when you say, well, what causes, say, Parkinson's or ALD? And if the answer is it's a combination of environmental and genetic causes, that's science speak for we don't have the faintest idea. And I see it over and over when I'm doing the research for conditions that I get these kind of stories. Um, so now that I've said my little number, give me that question again in an easier way.
So how
Oh,
does
pain. Got it.
like
Got it. Pain. Yeah. What we know about psychedelics in general, and microdosing is no different in this way, physiologically, they are anti-inflammatories. Now, if you take a high dose, and we learned this in the 1960s, we'd be doing basically psychotherapeutic work, but during the day, the person would not have asthma, would not have a cold, would not have the flu. Their symptoms would go away during the day. Often, what we also knew is they would take off their glasses. And we actually watched when people were coming down in the afternoon, and we knew where they were when they would ask for their glasses. Okay, so that there's a massive physical shift in kind of physical capacity, predominantly uh, with anti-inflammatories. And we know that one of the new ways of describing a huge number of conditions is inflammatory. So that's one that we know. We also know that we have neuroplasticity, which is improved brain connections. And we know that literally brain cells grown with, whatever Purina brain chow is given in labs. And you add a little psilocybin for some of the mice, but not for the others. These mice become smarter, more social, and live longer. So we do know that we're dealing with basic physiological systems, which is why I can talk about, um, Alzheimer's on the one hand and neuropathy on the other. You say, well, what do those have to do with each other? Well, in our medical system of specialization on specialization, they don't have much to do with each other. But if you have a body, they both come in the same box, and the same box is nourished in the same way, cell by cell, blood flow by blood flow. Uh, so they're in the high dose world. Um, what's the name of the particular neuron that everybody talks about? H1D2, I think.
5-HT2A, is that
Yeah,
the
2A, right. And I look at that and I think, I'm putting something into my mouth. It's going down my system. It's going into my liver. It's going into my bloodstream. Is it really just going to go to one molecule of all the different molecules in the whole body? Does that make sense? And if it does, all the other molecules in the body who have no interest. Okay? We've now begun. The fact is that if you in modern science, if you can measure and count it, it becomes really important. If you can't measure it and count it, then you tend not to mention it because it makes you look truthful, which is also that you're not, that you don't know what we're doing. So well, let me go back one because more of you probably know about this than you wish you did, which is just think and just look around the room you're in. How many people in that room have taken SSRIs? Okay, about half. Okay. What we know about SSRIs is they deal with serotonin. And there is a term called the serotonin hypothesis, which is taking SSRIs, improve your serotonin levels, and therefore you feel better. Um, there's a little section in our book on serotonin because at the end of talking to a number of very important scientists in this area, The conclusion is there is no evidence for serotonin being the variable. Now, that suddenly explains why 30% of people who take SSRIs get no benefits at all. If it was really physiological, and we all have the same physiology in so many ways, that would be unthinkable. So we're looking, the question, see, the question of the kind of good science questions like what causes it, what's the efficacy, what's the, what in the body does it affect? Those are hard questions, and those usually end up with specialists. I do what I call real world evidence. Real world evidence is, does it help someone? Does it not? And if it does, how do they say it helps them? And if you think about it, there's a new pharmaceutical that's good for something. And the way we know is people who have the something take it and they feel better. Now they first remember how did it get to them? First they gave it to mice. If the mice didn't die, then it's given to usually a slightly more expensive animal if those don't die. Then it's given to people in a very, very controlled way. And eventually your doctor says, this is a new such and such. I think it might help you. That's when real world evidence becomes important. And a great many drugs don't make it through that last step. With psychedelics, we're doing it the other way. We have thousands of years of people using it safely. And so we're kind of doing it the other way. So we're turning it around so that I don't really think we know very much about how it affects certain conditions. We do know that it affects them in a way that the body is healing. And at one point you mentioned brain concussion. I think you said in the same sentence as anxiety, right? Which is, if you think about it, for regular science, that's a big sweep. But what we know is both of them have something to do with the brain, and the brain concussion we really know. You should know that when people have a concussion and a part of the brain is physically damaged, there's almost nothing that modern medicine can do. What you're given is walkarounds because your brain has a lot of cells that it can use for other things. What we're finding with psychedelics and with microdosing in particular is people recover the functioning they lost. And again, let me just give you a story that doesn't go into much detail because this is a hockey player. Hockey players, almost by definition, they just live from concussion to concussion until they get retired. And they usually get tired like 4 or 5 years because so many concussions. So this was someone who had concussions and it had all of the treatments that were available. And there's some really nice treatments out there. There's some that are generally beneficial. However, his life was predominantly in his bedroom in the dark because that was where the least pain and the least stimulation. He began microdosing. He came out of the bedroom. He got dressed. He went out. He dated. He got engaged. He got married. And he stopped microdosing. So that's an over answer to your question.
Thank you, Jim. That's a great answer. I know our time with you tonight is short. There are some questions that we want to try to make sure we get to. And if any point in time, Jim, you needed to cut it off, just let us know, okay?
Sure.
I know one question that was in the chat, and then we'll get to Nathan because I do see his hand up. But there was a question about how faith and microdosing interact. So as someone who identified, I guess, in a moderate American Christian context,
Okay.
how can you describe the benefits of microdosing to maybe
Yeah.
folks who fit in that framework?
Yeah. Now, the question is really because high-dose psychedelics often question any spiritual framework because every spiritual framework is less than the truth. The truth is bigger than us, regardless of how we describe it. Microdosing actually, as far as we know, has no effect on belief systems, other than pathological belief systems. But if you are a good Christian, which means that you behave like a good Christian, regardless of what scriptures you use, microdosing seems to improve relationships between people. Paul Stamets says it very simply, mushrooms make people nicer. Now, from a spiritual standpoint, that's also one of the reasons people go to church. And we know that communities of the faithful, regardless of the faith, are healthier than isolated individuals. Microdosing improves relationships, it improves marriages. Very early on, I remember someone writing in and saying, "Hey man, if you knew what this does to libido, you'd have a real product." Okay, and so we really looked at that, and it turns out, yes, lovemaking improves, and it does for one of two reasons. And again, this is when you do real world stuff, you can't test for this. If you're having a better sex life, there are two possibilities. One is very simple, which is more libido, you're more turned on, you put on more good energy, and you attract energy, and so forth. The kind of supplements industry. The other is you become more aware of the other person. So you are nicer, you are paying more attention, you are less concerned with your own needs with the other. You basically are behaving as um, a better mate. And that also changes your sex life. Now, I'm very interested if someone wants to do a study or do research or ask all their friends, but that's where we are because those are the two sides of the change, which is inner physiological and inner mental. And part of the mental is you are more open to other people. Now, you're also more open to nature. I ended a talk once years ago in UC Santa Cruz, and someone came up and said, "Hey, I'm going to teach you a word." I said, "Okay, teach me a word." Icodelic. I said, "What's a icodelic?" She said, "A group of us every quarter we get together and we take a low dose of a psychedelic and we hike and we love nature more." And then I began to go into it, and it's very usual when you do surveys that people who use psychedelics indicate an improved appreciation and rapport with the natural world.
Great. I did have a question here. Nathan, your hand's been up for a little bit.
Yes, Nathan.
You can come off mute.
Thanks very much. This has been a truly valuable and informative, an invaluable lesson, particularly in the difference between microdosing and dosing, which is sometimes called
Yeah.
macrodosing, and in particular in how important it is to distinguish microdosing from what we think we understand about psychedelics in general. I think the analogy you used about a different band playing on the radio, maybe even a different radio station, was very apt. Now, a lot of your answers to a lot of these questions have emphasized some of the anecdotal evidence that shows
Right.
the value of microdosing and have also underlined the difference between scientifically verifiable evidence and what you're calling real or real world
Yeah.
evidence. It's a question I asked before this event that I wrote in. I wonder, because when you speak to, the scientific community at places like Johns Hopkins and
Yep.
Cal Berkeley, they will
Yep.
at least in public insist upon the necessity of rigorous scientific controls in order to validate the sort
Right.
of research that you're doing. But it sounds like a lot of what you're describing suggests that at least when it comes to microdosing, there is a kind of, the apparatus isn't fit to the object of observation. In other words,
Well,
the science
yeah,
is,
I got it. I got
yeah,
it.
yeah.
The problem for modern science, for anything you put in your mouth that somebody can make money off of, is the Food and Drug Administration controls that, and they say you need to do one specific kind of study called a double-blind experiment. The double-blind experiment is ideal for distinguishing, say, between one antidepressant and another. It's not ideal for something where everybody immediately breaks the blind because you really know, particularly with any high dose, whether you've been dosed or not. It's a bad tool. I mean, it's not a bad tool. It's just when you want to drill a hole and you only have a hammer, you don't then justify smashing things to get your hole done and say that's because the hammer is a fantastic tool. So we're dealing with a problem that science and especially regulatory science has to be somewhat rigid but it doesn't make the distinction when they're testing for a different way. For instance, the problem for the government is, well, how could MDMA be good for people with PTSD when it includes therapy? You say, well, that's how it works best. They say, but we don't have a regulation of how to measure therapy. You say, well, but that's how it works best. And they say, well, we're not going to let you use the drug because you're using therapy that we can't measure. And you say, I have some friends who say, if it's not in the Bible, I don't believe it. It sounds a little bit like that. So the problem that you're raising is what is acceptable evidence? And let me give you, the question of an anecdote, which is called, by the way, a report. Okay, anecdote means it didn't happen in my laboratory. Do you know how we measure depression? The most common condition on the planet. Do you know how it's measured? Okay, since
Survey
you're,
that. Yeah.
I mean, I'll tell you how it's measured. Someone looks at you and says, on a scale of 1 to 10, how depressed are you? Now, they also have what are called kind of surveys where you have like 40 or 50 questions about things. And then they say if you have so many answers that are in one direction, that's depression. This is high depression. This is a little depression. And there are 7 major instruments, which already tells you something if you understand science. If there are 7 major instruments, one isn't the best. So I went through those and I said, well, how many questions are the same across 7 of the important instruments used in depression studies? Okay, do you know how many questions were in all of them? 1. The question was, are you sad? Okay. So that's the hard science of depression studies using antidepressants or chocolate or psychedelics. So the science comes after there's enough real world experience that it's worth doing the science, not the other way around. So I'm hoping I'm answering your question by saying, um, and there's some fantastically good research studies. Okay.
And we want to be cognizant of everybody's time. That was a great
Okay,
answer. I
we're
know
gonna
our,
run a little late and we're gonna have some extra
yeah,
questions because I'm giving long answers.
we got a great one for you then. I'm
Okay.
able to say our friends who from St. Louis had a hard out at 8, so they've dropped off. So thank you to them. Our host Cheryl has a question for you. Cheryl, I'm gonna
So I was going to ask a wrap-up question, but since you're open to some additional questions, I do have one
Yeah.
about integration, and I want to mention that I've been microdosing for a couple of years now, just more intuitively. But then after I read your book, I started to do the Fadiman method, which is 1 day on and 2 days off. I know you know this already. I'm just saying it. Um,
I do.
and I have found significant improvement in feeling joy and connectivity to people around me. And
Hmm.
that's kind of what I struggle with complex PTSD. Anyway, so I started this journal, and then I started thinking about, which I'm leading up to the question I'm going to ask you, which is, how can we optimize integration? Is it,
Yep.
make sure your therapist is on board? Is it make sure you journal these prompts? Because I thought, oh, I'm going to make my own journal templates.
Sure.
How can I best maximize this? Because I'm not getting any younger, and I want to feel happy and joy more than I feel pain and suffering from my trauma.
Well, well, fortunately, you're in the majority.
Yes.
Okay. So, what we also have occurring, I'm thinking of microwaska, which people are trained to help people improve their own microdosing with feedback and support. The Microdosing Institute in the Netherlands, both of these people now train facilitators, what they're called. Um, there's several people in the Bay Area, one of them that I worked with for a while, Danielle Nova, who also helped found the San Francisco Psychedelic Society, does trainings of microdose facilitators who will work with people like you who want to get the maximum out of microdosing. And again, PTSD has a huge press about how impressive, and it's true, MDMA plus a whole lot of therapy does. And it's absolutely true. And it's criminal that it isn't made more legal. In our book, there's a little quiet corner, which I don't like to talk about in front of my MDMA friends who've spent years working, where someone did a little research survey and said, is there anyone out there who's used just microdosing for PTSD? And Richard Knowles and his little group have not too many people, but there are people who are just using microdosing and paying attention, and if it's appropriate, journaling for people who like to journal. Journaling is terrific. I'm one of those, and it's invaluable, particularly if you go back a few years and you wonder who could have written that, and then you realize it's you. And you've changed and things have happened. So there are facilitators, there are trainings, there are coaches, and there are different methods, and that's becoming more available. Um, in our book, we don't kind of recommend anyone special, um, but usually your local psychedelic societies, and most of you are part of societies of one sort or another, are probably running into this. And I know certainly in the Chicago area, there's an active group of both facilitators and guides. Guides is a term used for people who help you with high doses. So it's out there. Um, it is a new kind of occupation because having worked with a couple of the training groups, both Europe and Peru and here, these are people who are saying, I am making a career change and I'm going to be putting out my shingle very quietly that I will help people with their psychedelic uses, be it high dose or for many people, they work only with microdosers. Does that answer you, Cheryl?
Yeah, yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Was there anyone hang on, there was a request here. Actually, yeah, was there any final question from our in-person folks who were nice enough to visit here at the shop this afternoon or evening? Because if not, I do have one question, just because I know that there'll be all kinds of legality stuff coming up, as each individual states, but also across the country, being able to hopefully legalize some of these things. What can we do, I guess, as advocates, to be as the best advocates we can be for microdosing?
It's the same really question that we were asked earlier about being a Christian. The best advocate is to say when someone says, you've been nicer lately. And that really, someone says, well, I'm now, reading Reader's Digest, or I've stopped watching Fox News, or I'm exercising, or I'm microdosing. So when people notice that you're better, they will ask you why. And if nobody notices, you're not as better as you thought. Okay. Um, but we are developing subcultures to help each other and to support each other. The reason that we put out a book that's so extensive, we have like 38 different physical and mental conditions. Plus, we haven't talked much about performance. I'll just give you a quick one. This is a half marathoner. And after he realized in his practice runs that he was doing better when he microdosed. So he and I agreed that he would microdose for his next race. And he wrote me a little note. And this is for you runners, half marathon. He said, I took 20 minutes off my time. That's a big amount. And then he said, it's the best I've run for 10 years. This is a guy in his 40s. So we're looking at a shift in the athletic world that is actually happening perhaps faster than anywhere else. Long distance marathoners. This is people who do 100 miles. Okay. I don't know who they are and I don't understand them, but they love it. And it is now almost understood throughout that small world that microdosing is incredibly helpful for endurance, for energy and so forth. So that's part of that answer.
Jim, what final advice do you have for those listening, whether they're skeptical or novices or fellow enthusiasts? What advice would you give to the audience that is assembled to listen to you?
Well, it was so much easier to give advice before I published the book. But the purpose of the book was to have all the information that we've talked about today and some of the stories so that you could look at it and think about it and educate yourself. Because the other thing is when you are microdosing, you are going to learn how to give yourself the correct dose. Because what you'll learn is if you take a little too much, you're happier, but you notice that when you go to the gym, which you usually do with your microdose, that you kind of lose interests in doing the exercises. If you take too little, nothing happens. So you begin, as we do with most things, when people say, well, what's the really correct dose? I say, well, what's the correct dose of ice cream? Well, uh, okay, and then we then say, well, usually it's such and such, but sometimes it's different. Well, yes. So these are natural substances going into a natural package, and it doesn't fit. If you really need tight numbers, that's why you need a facilitator who will kind of work you through that, because that's just a mental problem. I've grown up with too much science and not enough walking in trees.
That's great. Well, everybody, why don't we give a big round of applause for Jim Fadiman?
Oh, also, I didn't mention the other advice, which is yes, I really recommend the book. Okay. And at the
Yes,
moment,
microdosing for health, healing, and wellness.
yeah, and at the moment, Amazon has cut the price a lot, and we're going to have a paperback in about 6 months. We just got a Spanish publisher who also
Excellent.
publishes within the United States to the Latin community. There are ways to get information. And we also have, microdosingbook.com, microdosingbook.com, one word. We particularly want stories about your own experience, but questions are fine.
All right. Well, thank you again, Jim, for taking the time for us. This was an excellent Q&A. I think everybody is walking out of this one knowing a lot more and feeling good about being able to spread the message about microdosing to those of us who are out there trying to fight the good fight. So thank you again for taking the time. Any last final words on the
Yeah,
sign off?
that the level of questions was that you all know a whole lot. Okay, this was very much second level questions. Okay, and that's terrific because that says you're a repository of a lot of knowledge of a community, and that's probably the most exciting part for me is knowing how much you know, and that more information will help. And we didn't even talk about dementia or schizophrenia or palliative care. Those are the biggies that are coming up in the next few years.
All right. Well, we'll be on the lookout for that. And
Okay,
yeah, as Cheryl just said, we'll have to get you back another time if we can.
terrific.
So
And I really
this
am,
was
I'm
great.
just so happy that so many people from so many different places are here. And thank you all. And thank you, Tom Roberts, for being a mentor to all of us. Tom gave me my first media experience working with Altered States on the air, and I've never forgiven him. Um, but we love each other in many other ways. Okay, thank you.
Well, Jim, I hope you feel the love we're sending to you from the
I
Midwest.
do. I feel
Thank
terrific.
you so much. And have a good night, and we'll talk soon.
Terrific. Thank you very much, you guys.
Everybody, thanks again, Jim. And again, I'll post it on the YouTube and I'll make sure I send you a link when it's up and going. Okay.
Terrific. Thanks a
All
lot.
right. Have a great night.
Great. Thank you, guys.